All right, welcome everybody. We're going to get started in probably like 30 seconds. Appreciate you all joining us. This is our first time doing one of these insight conversations. It's actually my first time being a part of a large Zoom event of sorts. So it's going to be fun to do this. I'm going to go to gallery view real quick just so I can see your guys' faces. Hi, everybody. Welcome. All right, so we still have more people who are going to be rolling in here, but I'm going to get started. First of all, thanks everyone for joining us for our first Insight conversation. I'm joined by Luke Burgis, who's going to be talking today around this space of desire, how our desires are formed, and how that really impacts our everyday life, right? And what we can do about it when we're armed with some of that knowledge around how our desires are formed. Before we dive in, I want to break down a little bit of the format of tonight. We're going to run until 8 o'clock Eastern time. So we got about 59 minutes left. We're going to do a hard stop at 8 o'clock. We're going to kick right off this conversation between myself and Luke pretty quickly. And then we're going to leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions from all of you. We're going to leave everyone on mute just to keep it kind of an orderly conversation between Luke and I. But we do want to have some participation from you to source your questions. Luke and I were just speaking prior to this, and he really wants to make sure that he can hear from you and can respond to the things that come up. So leave your questions that you have in the chat, and we will cover those towards the end in that 15-minute block. So this is our first Insight conversation. Many of you who are joining us today are from the Monk Manual community. If you're not, welcome to this Monk Manual community, at least for the next hour. The idea of Insight conversations comes from something that's been with me for a while, that a lot of people come to the Monk Manual because they're searching for, in some ways, a fuller life, right? They want to experience a deeper, more profound sense of presence, sense of being, sense of doing in their everyday life, just a fuller experience of life. And that while we often tend to focus on this concrete changes that we can implement in our lives, whether it's habits or whether it's certain behaviors that we might want to focus on, it's actually on a deeper internal level. It's often on the level of our thinking, how we understand both the exterior world as well as our interior world, that real transformation takes place, right? And so the vision behind these conversations is to talk to people who are doing important work in around ideas that are really fundamental, I think, to our potential as human beings. And tonight we're going to be kicking these off with Luke Burgis. Luke and I have known each other for a couple of years now. We first got connected actually through the Monk Manual. Was a big fan early on, and we've had a burgeoning friendship since then. And I've been able to watch him in the whole development of this book. And I know the topics he's going to be talking about tonight not only are extremely applicable to everyone in the community, I think all human beings really, but they're also deeply personal. I mean, Luke is someone who's gone very deep with these ideas, and they are big ideas. When you talk about big ideas, these are big ideas. So we're not going to be able to get through everything on this call. It's just really going to hopefully be a primer into some of the ideas that are found in his book, and largely a representative of the theories of philosopher René Girard. But I'm so excited to have Luke with us. Luke is an entrepreneur. He's also a professor. He's an author of, this might be his third book, I think. And I couldn't be more excited to have Luke join us tonight. So Luke, thank you for coming on.
Steve, thanks so much for having me on. Yeah, it was right near the beginning of your journey, I think, with Monk Manual and mine for writing this book that you and I started talking for the first time. So the book and the development of Monk Manual have tracked and kind of reinforced each other in various ways. So it's really good to be with you all.
Great. So I want to start with, so I have one of these wanting copies right here. And I had an opportunity to read this a few months ago, actually. And I can't tell you how helpful it's been for me to name and process certain things that I probably had a certain inclination towards, but wasn't able to exactly name, right? There's a power in being able to, I think we all have inclinations, right? When we might get stuck with something, right? Maybe there's a behavior in our life where we're trying to progress on our path towards X, Y, or Z, or there's a relationship we're struggling with. And we experience things on our path, but we sometimes can't actually put a name to it. And I found that the ideas presented in the book really, really helped me with that. And one of the core concepts is this idea of mimetic desire. And to be honest, when I first started engaging in the material, I did not really understand what mimetic desire is, right? It actually, it's kind of like a word that most of us don't have a lexicon that even ties in, right? Like, what is that? So I think that to start the conversation, what would be most helpful is if you could just give a really quick primer in what is mimetic desire, so then we can build from there.
Sure. So I spent a good deal of my life thinking about goals and habit formation. And I realized that a lot of people talk about goal setting. There's a lot of advice given for goal setting and habit formation, but not a lot of thoughtful reflection around why we come to choose the goals that we do in the first place. And that seemed to me to be really important. And it seems that sort of goals that we set emerge out of a certain environment and ecosystem and culture and system of desire that makes us want to achieve those goals in the first place. And that kind of thought haunted me throughout my 20s as I was moving from one industry to the next, going from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, starting companies, and kind of feeling a lot of whiplash and not necessarily understanding why I was being pulled or attracted towards certain goals, certain achievements more than others. We have this common phrase in English like, people gravitate towards a person or gravitate towards a thing. And I think that's a really telling and interesting phrase that we have. Like, well, why do we use this language of gravity? It seems like there's some kind of force operative in our lives that does make us gravitate towards certain people and certain things. And I really didn't understand what it was in my life. And I really wanted to get to the bottom of it. And my discovery, which I came through a lot of self-reflection, a long personal journey, and through the ideas of the French thinker René Girard, was this concept of mimetic desire. And I'll explain what that means. And we're only going to have time to introduce the concept today and explain a couple of practical ways that it plays out in our lives. But it's very counterintuitive. At least it was for me. It was shockingly counterintuitive to the way that I sort of understood human desire and understood why I pursued the things that I pursued. Has anybody on the call seen or are familiar with a commencement speech given by David Foster Wallace at Kenyon College called "This is Water"? Is anybody familiar with that? Hands up or in the chat. I'm just curious how much context I need to give. So David Foster Wallace is a is a now deceased author of fiction and many essays, and he gave this commencement speech at Kenyon College called "This is Water" that I encourage you to watch, because the first time that I watched it really kind of shook me up. And I'm going to quote one line from the speech because I think it's really relevant to this topic. So he was talking about to college graduates, what's the purpose of your education? What's the purpose of a liberal arts education to begin with? And he said, I tend to be, I'm quoting him and I'm looking at my iPad right now. This is what he said. I tend to be automatically sure of certain things. Everything in my own immediate experience supports my deep belief that I am the absolute center of the universe, the realest, most vivid, and important person in existence. We rarely think about this sort of natural, basic self-centeredness because it's socially repulsive. We don't like to think about that or think about that in other people. But it's pretty much the same for all of us, he said. It's our default setting hardwired into our boards at birth. Think about it. There's no experience you've had that you are not the absolute center of. The world as you experience it is there in front of you or behind you, to the left of you, to the right of you. And he was saying that this is kind of a default wiring, a default setting that we have in terms of the way that we think and process the world. And he was trying to get the graduates to understand that you don't have to be a slave to this default setting, right? This default setting, like part of reading, part of getting to know other people and entering into relationships is about getting out of the default setting of which we're at the center of everything, and the world kind of revolves around us in terms of education and understanding why people could think differently than we do. It's a beautiful speech. I think it's very powerful. There's like an 18-minute YouTube that you could find very easily online. I think somebody just dropped it into the chat. And that I bring that up because Wallace was not talking about desire. He was really talking about the life of the mind and about empathy and about sort of getting out of the skull-sized kingdoms or prisons that many of us live in and trying to encourage the graduates, right? This is part of what education is all about, so that you can understand the world and choose what's meaningful and what you want to pay attention to and not just react. Well, that idea is really fundamental to the idea of mimetic desire, because most people, I certainly did, have an idea of desire as being my own, as being kind of generated out of this, secret, organ that I have inside of myself or in my heart, where I just generate desires and they're mine. And I rarely question them. I just kind of take them for granted. Oh, I want to do this thing. That's what I want. And there's very little discernment that went into my desires through the first 27 years of my life. And it was because that was very much my approach to desire. So what Wallace was talking about in terms of the intellectual life and the mind was my understanding of desires. Girard totally sort of blew this understanding of desire apart from me, because he said that human desire is not autonomous and independent the way that we normally think about it. And he said that understanding of desire is what he called the romantic lie. He said if you read like a bad novel, the characters in the novel desire with the romantic lie. The author will write the character just like spontaneously, all of a sudden wanting something or wanting to be with somebody. Like desire is spontaneous. And he said that that's a lie. That's not the way that it actually works. And those are usually not very good novels or works of fiction because that's kind of fake. And he says human desire is not always autonomous, it's mimetic, meaning it's imitative. He said we're social creatures, and therefore, a true understanding of desire, which takes some humility to accept, is one in which we acknowledge the influence that others have had in generating and shaping our desires. And we could give example after example of this. And that desires are mimetic, and that we look to other people, usually pre-consciously or subconsciously, as models of desire. So if nobody else wants something, we begin to second guess ourselves and wonder if that thing is actually wantable. Whereas if a lot of other people, or especially somebody we really admire or respect, really desires something, especially somebody that we feel knows what they really want, maybe is a little bit more confident than us, it seems happy. We really care what they want. Those are very powerful models of desire for us, and we're influenced by those models more than we realize and understand. Now, I just want to make one thing clear before I pause and let Steve kind of interject. When we talk about desire, I'm not talking about like fundamental kind of needs that are more hardwired into our nature. So those things, let's just call those things needs. If I'm dying of thirst in the desert, I don't need a model to help show me that I really want to drink water. I'm hardwired. I have instincts That if I see an oasis, if I see a puddle of water, I'm going to go drink from it. I don't need models for those kinds of things. If I'm starving, I'm going to eat. If I'm cold, I instinctually seek warmth. Girard noticed, though, that the nature of desire, when we get past these things, and this is most of life nowadays, by the way, right? Our desires are more abstract. It's brands and career paths, a lot of more ephemeral things. We don't have instincts. We're not hardwired, to choose one or the other on a biological, physiological level. So Girard said, what we do have, though, we still have signposts. We still have a radar, and the radar comes in the form of our fellow humans or other people, real or fictional, groups or individuals. I think about the way, if anybody has read, the great novel Don Quixote, you have this guy who's alone in his room reading this book about this great, gallant, heroic knight. And all of a sudden he reads the book and is just inflamed with this desire to become one too. So that's an example of a model can be totally fictional. That's why the things that we read really matters, right? Because they can affect our desires for various things. But the more important ones are the ones that are close to us, that are in our lives. And this is essentially what my book is all about, is the world is shot through and through with mimetic desire. We're more social than we realize, and our desires are contagious. If you think about the people that are close to you and the things that they want, it's shocking how much they affect us and influence us. And this was a real eye-opening for me. It was just a way for me to kind of question my own goals and desires and start to think more seriously about the kinds of influences that were at work in my life.
Yeah, so I think the reason I was so excited to talk with you today, or to share these ideas with the Monk Manual community, is, we all set certain goals or ideals in our life, right? And what's fascinating to me is even the idea of productivity or success, right? Like, we all have in our mind an image of success, right? Every single person on this call has an image in their own mind of what success looks like, right? And what you find, I believe, I mean, there are people who have gone fairly deep into this, but even just going from my own experience, right? I'm only probably halfway through my life, if I'm even halfway through my life. Maybe I'm towards the tail end and I just don't know it yet. But presumably I'm less than halfway through my life, and I've already seen how I could be so confident or feel so closely aligned to certain things that I feel like this is really important. I really need this, right? That I could even center certain aspects of my life around particular things that then in hindsight, you look back and you're like, that was really, that thing that seemed super consequential to me at the time, that felt like it was worth sacrificing all these things for, was actually not consequential. So to give a very, very simple example, right? Think of maybe a teenager, right? Who the biggest thing on their mind is like the girl in their class or the boy in their class, or what does this person think of me or that person think of me, right? There's a lot going on socially during that time, and there are reasons for that. But you end up seeing how some of that in hindsight, through wisdom, you end up finding that maybe some of that energy was misdirected away from the ultimate purpose that you come to see later on, right? And so what you have is this weird dichotomy where a lot of people, as they get older in life, or as they're aging, they end up realizing certain things that I think could have really directed a lot of their energy earlier on. But at that point, it can't really be done. You can't turn back the clock necessarily, nor is it necessarily a helpful thought experiment to go and do that. But what I'm really interested in hearing your response to is knowing that a lot of desires that we may have are not truly our own, or at least are influenced. Like we can't leave that reality. The fact that we're heavily influenced by placing value on things that other people place value on. How do you how can you break through that? How can you kind of align with a deeper sense of your desire or deeper purpose?
Hmm. So mimetic desire is a tremendously positive thing. I mean, the fact that we are open to our fellow human beings and that we're able to get under the surface level and empathize with them and even discern what it is that they want. That is a powerful ability that a human being has that no other creature in the universe has, right? There have been studies shown that from the like 2 years of age, a baby can discern what an adult wants and get under the surface of what the adult is sort of portraying that the adult wants and get to the level of their intentions. I talk about this in the book. It's a very famous study where toddlers can basically do something that they intuited that the adults wanted to do. So the fact that we can discern the desire of other people is very, very powerful. And imitation and mimesis is the basis of education. It's how we learn. It's how we develop culture. We learn language. It's so crazy that babies even cry differently. I mean, they're so good at this. The intonations of their cries imitate the tonations of their mother's voice. That's why babies who are born to mothers in different languages actually have different cries, because they're imitating the intonations already in the womb. So I think it's important to realize that this is great. I mean, this is a powerful force in human nature. And I would encourage anybody, throw it in the chat. I mean, who are your role models? Can you put your finger on somebody that's positively influenced you in something in your life? It could be the major that you chose in college. It could be, the job that you took after college, or a career change, or influenced, why you're with your spouse, something like that. I mean, I'd be interested to hear. I think that most of us can identify one person in our life, grandparent, a parent, a friend, a teacher that we've had that's been a positive role model, and we can identify that they've shaped our desires. And usually we go back. I tend to find that when people do that exercise, they thank you for Kathleen for sharing. When people do this, they tend to go back a ways. They tend to go back in their lives and talk about formative experiences that they've had. And that's really interesting to me, because it's almost as if like we don't necessarily notice as much in the present as we do in the past. So one of the realizations that I've come to, that I talk about a lot in the book, is there are thin desires and there are thick desires. And knowing the difference is really, really important. The thin desires are the ones that I would say are highly mimetic and don't have a lot of solidity to them. Okay, like could be that my friend got a dog during the pandemic. Actually, all my friends got dogs during the pandemic. And all of a sudden I really, really wanted a dog, or to watch a certain Netflix show, or to I don't know, to read a certain book, right? And I would just become like inflamed with, all of a sudden I just really want to do this thing. But after a few days, it sort of goes away. And I went through most of my 20s kind of like this, just like not sitting with the desires and giving them any time to kind of reveal themselves for what they were, right? And taking time. Silence is really important. I mean, getting some distance from the noise is really important. And one of the ways I found to be able to kind of separate, the wheat from the chaff, has been kind of like, how do we get underneath and discern what's thin and what's thick? Because there are really positive desires that have been implanted in us that we pursue by people that we love and by people that love us, not just influencers on social media, or things that the culture, like desires that the culture is giving to us. How do we create some distance from that? One extremely powerful exercise that I've used, and I only know it because a very wise mentor took me through it, is he had me mine my life for stories of deeply, deeply fulfilling accomplishments or actions that were very meaningful to me. Okay. So these don't have to be important by anybody else's standards, just mine. So one of mine is, um, inventing this orange peeling machine in my fifth grade science class. I didn't actually make anything. I just mapped out the idea on a big poster board and presented it to the class. But to this very day, it's one of the things that I'm most proud of. Another one is I learned to cook a really good Roman pasta dish and perfected it, and that's another one. So none of these things, right? When I go back and look at my life, are these really crazy, like, kind of worldly achievements that brought me financial success or anything like that. They're just things that were really important to me, and there are signs a little bit. There are signposts that I need to pay attention to, of deeper desires, that continue, that stay with me, right? That don't go away, right? Thin desires are like leaves. When there's a gust of wind, they can blow away. The thick desires are like layers of rock that build up. And the interesting and fascinating thing about that exercise, if you do it and you go through and you identify 3, 4, 5, hopefully you have 10 stories like this or 10 experiences. I began to find little patterns in them, patterns of motivation, patterns of desires, like things that I was that really bring me joy and fulfillment. And the things for me might be very different than the things for you. But that was one way for me to begin to kind of separate out what are the things that I'm going to chase today that I'm going to be, over next week or next year. I mean, I started companies and poured 80 hours a week and a lot of money into these companies, and then woke up one morning and didn't really want to go into the office every day. And that was a jarring experience for me. And I got to a certain point where I was like, I don't want to do that again. I don't want to invest myself in a desire that might be ephemeral and fleeting. Which are the ones that are going to lead to genuine fulfillment? This is around the time I started thinking seriously about relationships and work, and I decided to take some time off. And this is one, I talk about 15 things in the book. This is one of them that was deeply, deeply helpful for me.
So when we talk about models, the individuals in our lives that model these desires for us, there are some that we may be conscious of, others we're not maybe conscious of, but certainly we're surrounded by models all the time. One of the and this is one of those areas I wouldn't have had a language for, but one of the things that attracted me, I think, to monks was some form of like mimetic desire, right? Seeing something in monks that seemed to exhibit. Honestly, I would say that most of the people who have bought a monk manual, used the monk manual, on some level, they've recognized some fullness of being within a monk that they either knew directly or their image of a monk, and there was something that they think, yeah, I want what that is, right? That strikes me as different from different and better than maybe these other models. At the same time, I think a real struggle for a lot of people, myself included, and it's funny because again, I can't see kind of the nature of like any illusion is like you're not necessarily aware of it at the time, right? You see it after the fact. Oftentimes I sense that some of the models that have been models of thinner desires are actually have almost a stronger, maybe attractive like quality, right? On some level, right? There's a reason why we go and see the person with like the private jet or something, and that person is often they might have more of a power to kind of draw than the quiet monk going about their humble work. Even though if we really kind of like sit with it, we end up thinking, yeah, I'm probably actually do want that more than I want that. And yet we still, I think, sometimes find ourselves attracted to certain models. What's going on there? And how can we become more conscious of that?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, there's another point that I want to make about that too, which is it's a double-edged sword. We have to be intentional about the kind of models that we select, and discern which of the ones are kind of creating a flash in the pan and igniting, kind of a fleeting passion, and which are the kinds that we really want to cultivate and get to know better. And I think there are certain things to kind of notice internally, about what certain kinds of models are being around certain people do to you. I even have students in one of my classes, um, watch commercials on television, and then we talk about what they're doing to us as we're watching them in terms of affecting our emotions and affecting what we want. But that's a habit of being that we can develop, right? Of just like having an internal awareness about the ways in which different models of desire, different people are affecting us. I mean, part of why this idea of mimetic desire is important is just knowing that we have models of desire at all. That's just step one. Just knowing that our desires are influenced and affected by models. Naming them is a second really important and powerful step, right? Just naming who they are, because how can you even begin to discern which ones are sort of leading to more of the lasting satisfaction and which ones aren't? So it's really, I find it's easy to name some of the positive role models that we've had in our lives. And I won't ask anybody to put this in the chat, um, but it's a lot harder to name the ones that are very close to us, who are possibly affecting us in ways that we're blind to, because that requires real kind of discernment and sitting with these things for a while, right? Sitting with the influences, the way that we can sit with our thoughts or emotions, and not run from them really quick. So I was, part of my story, which Steve didn't allude to, but he knows it, is that I was very attracted to the lifestyle and the desires of monks. And I was in the startup world and in the entrepreneurial world, and I couldn't find a model of desire that was really, that sort of transcended the day to day for me. I just couldn't find it in the little kind of closed system of desire that I was in, but I certainly found it in monks and people that seem to have a level of peace and serenity that I didn't have. And one very easy way to tell is, okay, when I spend time with this person, first of all, uh, some relationships take a really long time to unfold and develop organically, and we have to give them time and space to do that. Um, you know, Rather than assuming that uh, what we take away in the first 30 minutes or 5 minutes is everything. And I was kind of just fortuitous to be able to spend a good amount of time with, well, frankly, with monks. I ended up living with many of them for 3 years in Italy. And it took me a really long time to kind of have the positive kind of contagion rub off on me, whereas I was sort of dismissive earlier. So I think there's a certain, I think the way to discern the difference between the two is to always go slow, to like slow down in terms of the way that relationships unfold, and give them time and space to breathe and sit with them. And usually the positive and the more mimetic and the thin and the thick, I should say, begin to reveal themselves over time. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm answering your question, Steve.
I mean, it's a big question.
Yeah.
Maybe a follow-up on it is there such a thing? And I know we've talked about this a bit in the past, right? It's common for us to sometimes feel as if maybe we know, maybe I know I want one thing, right? Like I might say, hey, I have this particular value, right? But practically speaking, our values often are also kind of, they conflict, right? Now I'm using the term value fairly expansively here, but let's take something really practical, right? So I might value supporting local businesses, but I might also value saving money. So do I go and buy from Amazon and get something in 2 days, or do I go and steward the local bookstore, right? And our lives are just full of these decisions all the time. Small decisions like the one I just mentioned, and very, very large decisions. But I think that there's this inner layering of kind of stacked desires that are always occurring, right? Um, I feel like what ends up happening is often sometimes we don't know actually what we desire, right? And that can come through a certain level of discernment, getting quiet, working maybe with someone else to kind of help unpack that, going through certain processes, reflecting, even using things like the Monk Manual. But then there's also these occurrences where we'll sometimes feel like, man, I value this particular thing. I desire this particular thing more than this other thing. But in practice, sometimes this other thing pops to the top. In practice, sometimes I'm driving by McDonald's and I'm like, yeah, that cheeseburger, right? Even though I don't want that as much as I want maybe to be long-term healthy or whatever it is. And so what is the nature, or is there something, what's taking place there when the thin desires seem to win out over the thick desires?
Hmm. For one thing that I've noticed is that values themselves can be highly mimetic and subject to volatile change unless they're grounded in something sort of perennial, or unless we've really taken the time to think about the fundamental truths, and not just what's important to us on kind of an abstract level, but actually kind of uh, constructing a hierarchy of values wherever that comes from for you, for you, um, and thinking seriously about that. Because I find in companies or in the culture, the values can sort of ebb and flow, and it's kind of like there's this term liquid modernity, right? I mean, it's like it's an ocean where even the values themselves, like in our lives and in the culture or within companies, like what do we do when they come into conflict? Um, I had a good friend of mine schedule a bachelor party in Las Vegas on the Friday before Easter, and I had a conversation with my other friend, and I was like, listen, I friendship is a high value to me, and the Friday before Easter is a holy day in my tradition. Okay, so if I don't have any kind of hierarchy of values, well, I'm in a really bad place. Like, what do I do? There's this unbelievable tension that could just drive me crazy or put me in this position. That's kind of an extreme example, and for me, this was relatively easy discernment. I said we're going to celebrate in our own way, and at a different time. But I think that this happens all the time. I see companies that have, here are our 8 values, or people, here are the values, but there's no real relationship between them. So there's no actual hierarchy of values or way to discern, well, what happens when two come into conflict.
Mhm.
I mean, I think that happens all of the time. And it's not that, so there's some that are absolute and there are some that are relative, but that is one way, because in a sense, there's this feedback process where our desires can determine the things that we want, meaning our values. Our desires can shape our values, but our values can also shape our desires. And I think that second one is more important, right? Like taking a step back to discern what the values are when we're not in it. When we've taken whatever you need to do. For me, I try to take at least a 5-day silent retreat every year, where I begin to reorder, because they don't stay the same. They've changed through the course of my life. Where I look at that hierarchy of values, and I think about it and I test it. Well, how did I do last year? And is that going to be the way that the next year looks? And I discern. And that way, my value, I have some kind of solidity to those values, so that as I go back into my crazy life and world surrounded by noise, I can kind of come back to that at the end of my day, at the end of my week, and I've got like a reference point. Because I find that if I don't have that kind of construction that I've taken time to really think deeply about, then I'm just subject to my values can become very mimetic, and I'm very influenced by what other people around me are desire and value, without a real self-possession, without really taking the time to have made sure that this is what I want to own. This is really what I want to build my life around.
Mhm. So I just want to remind everyone who's live here on the call, if you have questions, we're going to hop into those in just a minute here. So leave those in the chat, and we're going to spend some time with Luke answering those. Before we hop into that, I know that there's a lot in this book, and there's also a lot of specific exercises or practices within wanting. With that said, are there any practical tips, if you were going to give one or two kind of practical action steps or recommendations to implement some of the core learnings that you've come through in the ideas of the book? If you could just offer those, and then we'll hop into the questions.
Sure. So one of them is to do that exercise that I described, in terms of trying to identify. I would say I challenge you to find three of those stories from your life that seem to have been coming from a place of thick desire. What were you doing? What exactly was the action? What was motivating you? What was so important about it? Find three. And there's I have sort of a one pager that I can share with anybody who's interested. If I can find it, I'll even put it in the chat. That's kind of a guide to doing the exercise, or we can find a way to get it to you after the call with the notes for the record, for the recorded version of this. I would encourage you to do that. I mean, that's one way of sort of discerning the difference between thick and thin. Taking some time to seriously think about who are the models in your life, right? The positive role models. And then the hard part, which is really thinking about, who are the models of desire that are really, really close to you. Like let's just use the workplace as an example. Every workplace, and if you're not in a workplace right now, you could either think about one that you've been in, or you could think about a family, your family. You could think about friends. You could think about some system of desire that you are a part of. I think it's important to kind of visualize. I mean, maybe it's just because I'm a very visual thinker, but think seriously about how that system of desire works, right? Like who is modeling what's an acceptable sort of like desire and what's not, goals. How are the things circumscribed in that system of desire, right? In the one that I was in Silicon Valley, the one that I was in for 7 or 8 years, I'd never sort of realized that I had some desires that transcended that system, that transcended the closed system. So at a certain point, I literally drew a big circle on a piece of paper, and I inside of the circle there were people that were the really big sort of models of desire that everybody looked to. So in my world, those were some really serious investors. They were some entrepreneurs. Like when they did something, everybody paid attention. Everybody measured themselves according to them. They just loomed really large, and they were all kind of inside the circle. And the interesting thing was all of the kind of desires and goals and things that they were modeling were also inside of the circle. And when I really paid attention, I noticed that there were some things outside of the system that were really important to me, but I'd forgot to look outside of the circle. I just was in it. It's like, this is water. I'm in the fishbowl and I can't see outside of the fishbowl. And I needed models that were outside of it. And luckily they broke in, and I found them that way. So unfortunately we don't have time for a whole lot more, because I really want to make sure that this can be interactive and we can talk. But those were a couple little things that I did that I found incredibly powerful.
Perfect. Good. So we do have some questions that have come in. This first one here is: are there ways that mimetic desire can reinforce the thick desires? What kind of practices do you do to make your values affect your desires positively?
That's a great question. Yeah, there's kind of I think it's possible to put a kind of positive feedback loop or flywheel into effect with our desires. when I lived in the community, when I lived with about a dozen monks, um, there were I was very intentional about um, kind of about the ways in which um, I I shared my values with them, um, and have open and honest conversations about kind of what are the sort of the deepest desires of my heart, and understanding theirs, and having conversations, because most of us are guessing. You know, we're guessing certainly with other people, and we're even guessing sometimes with ourselves, and we don't really know it. So I found that being able to have a little bit more transparency within the boundaries of privacy and self-disclosure, obviously, about those things, being able to have those conversations, um, allowed us to kind of come out of the dark a little bit with like what was important to us, and what we desired. And sometimes the conversation involves, like in the workplace, like I really want this position that I know that you want to. Like this is a very typical example. Because normally those things are like in the dark. Well, I can't tell anybody. I don't want anybody to kind of know that I secretly desire this thing. So for me, part of the positive reinforcement came with transparency. Other simple examples are like with in regards to my health and fitness. There are certain things that I can do between now and the time that I go to bed that will make it more or less likely that I want to work out tomorrow morning. And then there are other things that I can do tomorrow, and I sort of have an idea in my mind about how they fit together into a literal flywheel that I can either have it gain momentum, or I can totally shut it down and have it start moving in the other direction. So again, I think because I'm visual, I've actually mapped out those flywheels in my life for everything from fitness to relationships to, just kind of the 5-year goals, and the way that my desires are going to unfold if I do certain things, if I live in certain places, if I engage in certain groups and activities. I think it's just bringing a level of intentionality to it that's been really important.
Good. So when you're asking us to examine moments in our lives, do you mean those times in life that one remembers vividly with great self-satisfaction? It's just a question of clarification, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a few components to it. So it's a time when you engaged in some action, when you chose to do something, and you did it, and it brought you a deep sense of joy and satisfaction at having done it. Now it's got to be you, right? So it's saying something essential about kind of who you are, that this particular part of that achievement was so meaningful to you. So it's one thing to just be able to name, okay, here's something that brought me satisfaction and joy maybe 15 years ago. Isn't it interesting that it still makes me relive that joy just thinking about it? That's pretty cool. Like not a lot of us have ever been asked to tell one of those stories. So this kind of storytelling process works really good in groups if you do it with a good friend and you share these stories with one another. But the second most important part of the process is trying to identify what was it about that accomplishment that seemed to have given you the satisfaction and seemed to be so meaningful. Because three people can do exactly the same thing and find meaning in three entirely different ways. You can have three artists standing on a mountain in Zion National Park, painting a canvas of the beautiful landscape below. And if you ask them, and they all find satisfaction and joy from doing that thing. But if you ask them, they'll give you three entirely separate answers. So for you and for me, it's important to start to get at why. And I actually have I have an assessment that I've been using for a decade that a friend of mine introduced me to. It's called the motivational code, where you basically tell three stories and you answer 50 questions about each of the stories. And the questions are just designed to help you kind of try to get at what this essential desire or motivational drive was, right? And then it helps you find a pattern between the three. And the first time that I did it, it was revelatory for me because it saw things that I'm too close to see, and it gave me language to help me understand some of those core motivational drives. I'll just very quickly give you one example. In all three of the stories that I told, there was some element of me comprehending something and then giving expression to it. So one of my core motivational drives and desires is to comprehend and express. So that's one of the 27 kind of themes that are part of this report. And I never would have been able to articulate it that way. It's why I really enjoy writing a book. Like it forces me to comprehend something and then express it. But there's a lot of people that's not how they're motivated. They just want to comprehend, but they don't care about the expression, or they don't need to express it in this kind of comprehensive way that I really need to. So there's something really beautiful about that kind of process of self-discovery, to find out what really is driving you to do certain things. And the reason it's beautiful, and I have all of my students do this, it's like, hey, if you're just really disengaged with certain things, you can often find some way to reframe it in a way, and think about it in a way that helps engage more of that sort of core motivational desire that you have, right? It brings more of the things that you're seeking into play.
A follow-up question on what you were just sharing. Amy asks, where can we find this motivational code to try out?
So I will share let me put it in the chat right now. So I'm going to expand this, and here's the easiest place for you to find it. It's going to be right here at lukeburgis.com/motivation. So this is about a half-hour process to go through. It's an online assessment with very good friends of mine that developed this. It takes 30 minutes. You tell 3 stories. You answer 50 questions about each story. It costs $49 normally. It's the best $49 I ever spent. On that website that I just shared, you'll get $10 off just for being on the call. So it'll be $39. The code for that you can use is Burgis 10. Okay, and there's instructions on the website about how to do it. I have 10 that I can give away for free for people on the call. So I got permission from them to give away 10. So what I'll do is this: anybody who has ordered the book or will order the book by the end of the day tomorrow, forward me your receipt to m@lukeburgis.com, and we'll randomly draw 10 people that do that, and notify them that you'll get it for free, so you don't have to pay anything at all. But you don't have to. The assessment is powerful because it gives language and describes some of the core motivational drives that you might not necessarily make on your own. But it's very, very powerful to still go through the exercise. And the template, by the way, to go through the exercise is also on that website, without actually taking the formal assessment. That's just if you really want to go all the way. If you're interested in doing it, all the instructions are there, but you certainly don't have to get a ton of benefit and a ton of fruit for yourself.
Yeah, and this goes without saying, because many of the people on the call using the Monk Manual, you're already used to, in some ways, investing in that reflection piece, but highly recommend processes like this. Although it does take some time, it may feel like you're having to slow down unnecessarily. I truly believe that's those sorts of activities that end up paying the greatest dividends in our overall life satisfaction, and also our impact on those around us. So, a couple other questions that have been coming up in here, and I'm going to try to consolidate them a bit since we don't have a ton more time. If I could frame this up, as you were going through your self-discovery process, did you end up finding that a lot of your own desires were heavily influenced by family of origin, specifically parents? And then to kind of continue on that line of thinking, some of the other comments I'm seeing in here is even thinking through some of those core experiences that are deeply meaningful, also seeing how those heavily relate to maybe that family of origin or those parental figures. And so how do you make sense of that, right? And I would imagine, and I could be projecting here, but I would imagine that part of what's even in that is, we're so, our parents, our families feel so foundational to us, right? So it's easy for us to like kind of question or distance ourselves sometimes from X, Y, or Z external influence, right? But our family feels it, our identity actually feels kind of intermingled, right? So did you find that, first of all? And then how do you also, what do you do with that if that is the case?
I'm just answering a question before I forget. Family of origin is critical. And our parents were all of our first models of desire, no doubt about it. But then we get to a certain point, typically adolescence or earlier, where we look for others and we find them sometimes in the form of older siblings or people in school. It's a funny thing. I'm an only child. I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I got to a certain point when I was in high school, and I just wanted to basically, I kind of like rejected all of the desires and everything that anybody in my high school kind of was modeling to me, and what my parents had modeled to me, everything. And the funny thing is that it's a form of negative imitation if you think about it. Like they're still our models, and we're just reacting to them, and we're just reacting to them in different ways. So it's called like mirrored imitation or negative imitation in the book, where the kids in my high school were like rivals, and I just wanted to differentiate myself from them as much as I possibly could. So what did I do? I was like, I got to get out of Michigan. I'm going to go to New York, and I just found new models of desire, and then I wanted to differentiate myself from them too. So it's and when I go back, so here I was thinking that I was rejecting certain models, and I was doing my own thing, and I was so independent. And it wasn't until I was like 30 years old that I actually had the self-awareness to reflect on just how deeply my family of origin had influenced me, and to be able to trace the line. So that's a really important point. And being able to go back and see the like to trace the history of our desires, right? Augustine of Hippo had a beautiful book, the Confessions, where it's basically just a story of him going through his life, tracing the origin and the history of his desires and how they evolved. And I think that's a powerful exercise for any of us to do. And then to notice the friends, the parents, the family of origin, the influence that they have had, and then just to really acknowledge it and to understand the way that it shaped our journey is half the battle.
I had an experience once where a mentor asked me to write down all my daily practices and then why I did those things, right? And what was fascinating is coming to see that a lot of the behavior I was doing, I didn't actually have a why answer to, other than it was just something that was kind of passed on, right? And not that all of it was negative, but it wasn't really intentional. It was just there, right? So that sort of analysis or deepening, diving into one's background in the history of their desire, I think could be immensely powerful. We have just a couple of minutes here. I want to let you do a little bit of a sign off here, Luke. But for my own part, I really do want to highly encourage everyone to pick up this book, ideally this week if you can. For an author, usually the first week, it's kind of a meaningful launch time, right? It's the time where you want to go and generate the most traction, right? So that it can then kind of expand out. And I just really believe in what Luke's doing. I really believe in the ideas in this book. I think they're really important, and I think they can really transform people's lives. So whether it's for you or for someone else, highly encourage you to pick up Launching the Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life. And Luke, any last words here before we close out?
Thanks, Steve. And well, thanks everybody for being here. This is my first, the book came out on Tuesday. This is the first time that I'm doing anything like this. So this is really special for me. I've poured the last 2.5 years into this. So I never feel like I can do justice to this idea in an hour. But I hope I've given you a little taste of the central idea in the book is about mimetic desire. But at the end of the day, it's not spelled out quite this explicitly in the book. It's really, frankly, about love, right? I mean, desire. What is it all about? and what is it all leading towards? And that's kind of where I was trying to get to in the book. So this is not just about, you know, our own fulfillment. If desire is mimetic and we're social, we are in some ways uh, responsible in a sense for the desires of other people. You know, everybody we come into contact with, there's some exchange that takes place, and that's kind of where the book is leading. And I think this has immense ramifications for our culture, for it's not just the way that we live our individual lives, but just the way that we um, talk and understand people that want different things than we do. The way that we understand our desires is evolving. So I do think, you know, there's a lot of layers to this idea that we didn't have time to get into on the call today. So if you pick up the book, you'll see those. I am available to you. I shared my personal email. Feel free to email me there at any time. This community is important to me. I've had a monk manual for well over 2 years now, and I've gotten to know Stephen. So I do want to make myself available. So feel free to reach out. And if you do want to enter the giveaway that I have for the 10 motivational codes, send that receipt to the m@lukeburgis.com account. Just because I'm a little overwhelmed these days with the book launch, and I want to make sure that I'm trying to keep that separate from the personal emails. But you can always reach out to me anytime, and I'm happy to answer questions via email. And you know, maybe next year Steve will invite me back, and we'll dive deeper into level 2.
That sounds good. Well, Luke, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining in today. I've really enjoyed this. It's been really life-giving for me. Appreciate everyone taking the time out of their busy schedule, and I hope you all have a great night. Pick up Wanting. I really think you're gonna love it. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.